My name is Hazel Moore. I'm 30 years old, born and raised in Austin, Texas. By day, I work in financial asset management. By blood, I belong to a family that believes money is love and control is loyalty. But nothing prepared me for what happened 3 days after my grandfather's funeral. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, half expecting hugs and closure. Instead, I stepped into a silent living room where the air was thick with tension and lies. My mother, Teresa, sat front and center, dressed in mourning black but smiling like she'd won a game no one else knew they were playing. Kyle and Brandon, my brothers, flanked her like backup singers in a rigged performance. And two men I'd never seen before in designer suits waited quietly near the coffee table. "Hazel," my mother began, her voice syrupy and rehearsed, "these gentlemen are here to help sort out Grandpa's affairs. It's simple, really. Sign here, and we'll all move forward as a family." She gestured toward a stack of legal documents thick enough to break someone's trust, or their spine. But I already knew what was in that will. 1 week earlier, in a law office downtown, my grandfather's attorney had revealed the truth. Franklin Moore left everything to me. The company, the real estate, the investments, all of it. Ever since, my family's masks had come off. The guilt trips turned into threats, the silence turned into smear campaigns, and this wasn't a reconciliation. It was a setup. So before I tell you what happened next, ask yourself, what would you do if your own family tried to force your hand? Because what I chose to do changed everything. If you had asked me 5 years ago what kind of woman I'd become by 30, I probably would have given you a polished answer. Something about climbing the corporate ladder, investing wisely, maybe even owning a lakeside cabin in hill country. But life doesn't hand you what you plan for. It hands you what you fight for. My name is Hazel Moore. I'm 30 years old, single, fiercely independent, and, until recently, completely invisible to most of my family. I live in Austin, Texas, in a modest one-bedroom apartment that smells like eucalyptus candles and black coffee. I work in asset management for a mid-sized financial firm. I keep spreadsheets like other people keep diaries. Order and logic have always been my armor. They had to be, because growing up in the Moore household meant learning how to survive in chaos. My family looks picture-perfect from the outside. Southern charm, big smiles, bigger secrets. My mother, Teresa Moore, is the kind of woman who can walk into a room and instantly make you feel like you've done something wrong just by existing. She has a flair for designer handbags, passive-aggressive compliments, and reinventing the past in her favor. Then there's Kyle, my older brother by 5 years, the golden child, always with a new business idea that just needs a little seed money. He's been a crypto millionaire, a gluten-free meal prep guru, and a failed app developer, all before turning 35. Brandon, my younger brother, is less ambitious but more manipulative. He's the one who always played the victim. When things went wrong, it was always someone else's fault. Usually mine. As for my father, he left when I was 7. Took his silence with him and never looked back. Which brings us to my grandfather, Franklin Moore. Now he was the real deal. Franklin wasn't just the patriarch, he was the foundation. A Korean War veteran, self-made businessman, and the proud owner of Moore Lumber Supply, a family-run hardware chain he built from the ground up with nothing but a GI loan, calloused hands, and a stubborn refusal to quit. To most people in town, he was Mr. Moore. To me, he was simply Papa, and he was everything my family wasn't: honest, consistent, loyal. He saw potential where others saw inconvenience. While my mom saw me as the quiet one, Papa saw me as focused. While Kyle teased me for reading balance sheets instead of fashion magazines, Papa handed me his company's profit-loss statements and said, "Try to find what's not adding up." I was 11 the first time he brought me into the back office of his main store. The place smelled like sawdust and fresh paper. He had a desk covered in paperwork and a wall of framed newspaper clippings featuring local business awards, trade expos, and a few grainy photos of him shaking hands with city council members. He handed me a clipboard and a calculator and said, "Help me figure out why this quarter's margins are lower than last." It wasn't a game. He meant it. That day, I found a clerical error in the supplier invoice log. Nothing major, but enough for him to notice. He grinned like I'd just solved a murder case and said, "Kiddo, you've got a sharp mind and the guts to use it. Don't let this family dull that edge." Those Saturdays at the store became sacred. Every weekend, he'd pick me up in his old Ford truck, drive us out to one of the locations, and teach me something new. Inventory management, vendor negotiation, payroll structure, customer service. He made business human, made numbers personal. Meanwhile, things at home unraveled. Mom's spending habits spiraled into absurdity. She cycled through credit cards like people cycle through seasonal wardrobes. I remember once coming home to find 7 shopping bags from Neiman Marcus spread across the kitchen table while the electric bill sat unpaid on the counter. She called it retail therapy. I called it a house on fire. Kyle borrowed money from Grandpa like it was his job. He'd pitch a new vision every 3 months, burn through the cash, and vanish for weeks. Brandon played the emotional leverage game. "If you really cared about me, you'd help me pay off my medical debt," he once said. Spoiler alert, there was no medical debt, just a brand new gaming rig and a trip to Vegas. I tried to stay out of it, focused on school, on work, on building something of my own. But Papa always found a way to keep me tethered to something real. When I got accepted into UT Austin's business program, he offered to pay my full tuition, quietly, without fanfare. I was thrilled. But 2 weeks later, the money vanished. Mom claimed it went toward family emergencies. What she meant was Rachel's nose job, Kyle's urgent tax penalties, and Brandon's car note. I took out loans, worked nights, never said a word, but Papa knew. He'd stop by the bookstore where I worked and pretend to browse the business section. Then he'd slip me envelopes of cash, always sealed, always with a note. "Keep going. You're doing everything right." When his health started declining, those visits turned into talks. Real ones. Hospital rooms became boardrooms. IV poles stood in for whiteboards. We didn't just talk about his condition, we talked about what came next, what the family would do, what I would do. "You're the only one who understands the value of what I built," he told me one night, gripping my hand harder than expected for a man on oxygen. "You don't see it as just money, you see it as something earned, something protected." I didn't understand the full weight of what he meant, not until after he passed. In that moment, I just nodded and said, "I'll handle it. Whatever you need, I'll handle it." I meant the estate paperwork. Maybe funeral arrangements. I didn't know I was promising to go to war. Because when his will was read a week later, when I sat across from Mr. Jefferson in that warm, oak-paneled law office and heard that everything had been left to me, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the center of a thunderstorm with a metal rod in my hand, and I knew exactly what was coming. Looking back, I realize now that everything I know about integrity, work ethic, and the quiet power of resilience, I learned from my grandfather, Franklin Moore. He wasn't a man who spoke often, but when he did, it landed like scripture. Not because he was dramatic, because he meant every word. Papa was old school in the best sense, the kind of man who ironed his jeans, shook hands like he was sealing a contract, and believed that a person's word was worth more than their credit score. But with me, he was different. When I was little, he didn't just babysit, he mentored. While most kids were watching cartoons, I was learning the difference between gross revenue and net profit from the backseat of his pickup truck. While my classmates brought dolls for show and tell, I brought a miniature ledger and explained what overhead costs meant. To him, I was never just a girl. I was a future partner. That kind of belief does something to you. I remember one afternoon, I must have been 13, We were sitting on the tailgate of his truck behind one of the Moore lumber warehouses. The air smelled like cedar and diesel. He handed me a Dr. Pepper, cracked open his own, and said, "You know why I bring you here instead of your brothers?" I shook my head, afraid of the answer. "Because you listen, you pay attention. You don't just want the reward, you want to understand the process." That hit me hard. Because it was true. I didn't just want to be successful, I wanted to deserve it. He taught me to balance the books, but more importantly, he taught me how to balance values. "If your business thrives but your people hate you, you failed," he'd say. "The real product isn't lumber, it's trust." On Saturdays, we'd walk the aisles of his stores, and he'd greet every employee by name. Not just managers, everyone. He knew their kids' names, their birthdays, which ones were secretly struggling to pay rent, and he helped, quietly, discreetly. Never as a favor, always as a responsibility. He used to say, "Hazel, people don't work for you, they work with you. And when you're not around, your reputation better be." I carried those words into every job I ever had. When I got my first internship at a regional bank in downtown Austin, he made me promise something. Don't become one of them. Don't get so good at numbers that you forget they represent real lives. That balance between compassion and control is what he drilled into me. Over late-night root beer floats, over ledger reviews at the dining table, even during his last hospital stays. He never stopped teaching. In fact, during his final year, when his heart started giving out and his steps got slower, he started giving me real access, financials, shareholder details, vendor disputes, legacy plans. It was subtle at first, like he was easing me into something. I didn't know it then, but I was already being positioned, not just as a successor, but as a protector. One night, just a few months before he passed, we were alone in his hospital room. The rain tapped lightly on the window, and the monitor beeped in the background like a slow metronome. He looked at me with those sharp, unflinching eyes and said, "They're gonna come for it." I didn't understand. "When I'm gone, your mama's gonna say she deserves it. Your brothers are gonna act like they earned it. And you, Hazel, you'll be the only one who doesn't ask, but the only one who actually knows how to keep it alive." He squeezed my hand, voice growing raspy but firm. "I'm trusting you to do the hard thing. Not the nice thing, not the popular thing, the right thing." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. He smiled, tired but proud, and whispered, "That's my girl." It was the last real conversation we had. He slipped into a coma a few weeks later and passed with the morning sun. I stood at his funeral, surrounded by people who wore black but barely knew what they'd lost. And I realized in that moment that my grief wasn't just about losing a person, it was about losing the only family member who saw me for who I truly was. But his trust? His legacy? That stayed, and I was going to honor it, no matter what it cost. Looking back, I realize now that everything I know about integrity, work ethic, and the quiet power of resilience, I learned from my grandfather, Franklin Moore. He wasn't a man who spoke often, but when he did, it landed like scripture, not because he was dramatic, because he meant every word. Papa was old school in the best sense. The kind of man who ironed his jeans, shook hands like he was sealing a contract, and believed that a person's word was worth more than their credit score. But with me, he was different. When I was little, he didn't just babysit, he mentored. While most kids were watching cartoons, I was learning the difference between gross revenue and net profit from the backseat of his pickup truck. While my classmates brought dolls for show and tell, I brought a miniature ledger and explained what overhead costs meant. To him, I was never just a girl. I was a future partner. That kind of belief does something to you. I remember one afternoon, I must have been 13, we were sitting on the tailgate of his truck behind one of the Moore lumber warehouses. The air smelled like cedar and diesel. He handed me a Dr. Pepper, cracked open his own, and said, "You know why I bring you here instead of your brothers?" I shook my head, afraid of the answer. "Because you listen. You pay attention. You don't just want the reward, you want to understand the process." That hit me hard. Because it was true. I didn't just want to be successful, I wanted to deserve it. He taught me to balance the books, but more importantly, he taught me how to balance values. "If your business thrives but your people hate you, you failed," he'd say. "The real product isn't lumber, it's trust." On Saturdays, we'd walk the aisles of his stores, and he'd greet every employee by name. Not just managers, everyone. He knew their kids' names, their birthdays, which ones were secretly struggling to pay rent, and he helped, quietly, discreetly. Never as a favor, always as a responsibility. He used to say, "Hazel, people don't work for you, they work with you, and when you're not around, your reputation better be." I carried those words into every job I ever had. When I got my first internship at a regional bank in downtown Austin, he made me promise something. Don't become one of them. Don't get so good at numbers that you forget they represent real lives. That balance between compassion and control is what he drilled into me. Over late-night root beer floats, over ledger reviews at the dining table, even during his last hospital stays. He never stopped teaching. In fact, during his final year, when his heart started giving out and his steps got slower, he started giving me real access. Financials. Shareholder details, vendor disputes, legacy plans. It was subtle at first, like he was easing me into something. I didn't know it then, but I was already being positioned, not just as a successor, but as a protector. One night, just a few months before he passed, we were alone in his hospital room. The rain tapped lightly on the window, and the monitor beeped in the background like a slow metronome. He looked at me with those sharp, unflinching eyes and said, "They're gonna come for it." I didn't understand. "When I'm gone, your mama's gonna say she deserves it. Your brothers are gonna act like they earned it. And you, Hazel, you'll be the only one who doesn't ask, but the only one who actually knows how to keep it alive." He squeezed my hand, voice growing raspy but firm. "I'm trusting you to do the hard thing. Not the nice thing, not the popular thing, the right thing." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. He smiled, tired but proud, and whispered, "That's my girl." It was the last real conversation we had. He slipped into a coma a few weeks later and passed with the morning sun. I stood at his funeral, surrounded by people who wore black but barely knew what they'd lost. And I realized in that moment that my grief wasn't just about losing a person, it was about losing the only family member who saw me for who I truly was. But his trust? His legacy? That stayed, and I was going to honor it, no matter what it cost. If my grandfather was the anchor that kept us steady, then my mother was the storm that never passed. Teresa Moore was raised on tradition but addicted to illusion. She knew how to play the role of the Southern matriarch, pearls, pot roast, and perfectly curated Bible verses. But behind closed doors, it was chaos wrapped in Chanel. She never worked a day in her life. Not because she couldn't, because she never saw the point. To her, hard work was for people without options. And in her mind, being Franklin Moore's only daughter was an option, a pass, a privilege. A golden card she intended to swipe until it snapped in two. Growing up, I saw it all. The shopping sprees disguised as therapy. The weekend trips to Dallas that ended with designer bags and overdue bills. One time I came home to find the water turned off because she'd spent the utility money on Botox and a limited edition handbag. When I questioned her, she didn't deny it. "You don't understand," she said. "Image matters." But what mattered to her wasn't legacy, it was leverage, especially when it came to Grandpa's money. For years, she treated his generosity like a personal checking account. "Need a new car? Call Daddy. Medical emergency." Call Daddy. Want to remodel the kitchen for the third time in 2 years because marble is out, quartz is in? Call Daddy. And to be fair, he usually answered. Because despite knowing exactly who she was, my grandfather couldn't stop trying to save her. It wasn't just my mother either. Kyle, my older brother, was a professional charmer with zero follow-through. He had that entrepreneurial spirit that never actually turned a profit. Every time he'd pitch a new idea, Mom would co-sign it emotionally, and Grandpa, reluctantly, would co-sign it financially. There was Clean Plate, a gluten-free meal prep startup that tanked in 6 months. Then came GravPay, some crypto-adjacent payment platform that just needed runway. And who could forget Red Zone VR, a virtual reality football training program for high schools. He even trademarked a slogan, "Revolutionize the huddle." That venture cost Grandpa nearly $90,000. But Kyle always came back with a smile and a new pitch. And somehow, Mom always defended him. "He's just trying to make something of himself," she'd say. "Unlike you, always judging, always withholding." Meanwhile, Brandon, the youngest, played a different game, the victim card. Where Kyle leaned into ambition, Brandon leaned into helplessness. He flunked out of 2 community colleges, spent most days gaming or doom-scrolling Reddit, and called every anxiety spike a medical crisis. Don't get me wrong, mental health is real, but Brandon used it as currency. Anytime there was talk of accountability, he'd retreat into a shell of fragility so convincing even I doubted myself. "I just need a little help, Hazel," he'd whisper. "Mom says you don't care, the worst part." It worked. Not on me, but on Grandpa. Again. And again. Over the last 5 years of his life, I watched my grandfather give away more than $300,000 to support the family. New cars, tuition checks that were never cashed, medical bills that turned out to be cosmetic procedures, loan payments for debts they never even tried to repay. I knew it. He knew it, but he still wrote the checks. Every time I tried to intervene, even gently, he'd shut me down with the same sad smile. "They're still my family, Hazel." And I'd nod, swallowing my frustration, wondering if I was being too harsh, too rigid. Until the day I found the ledger. It was tucked inside his personal study, filed under F. Moore, Private. A bound notebook, black leather, handwritten entries dating back nearly a decade. Each line item documented in detail, date, amount, recipient, reason, and outcome. Next to each entry, he'd write small reflections in cursive. "Kyle promised to repay. Doubtful. Teresa said this was the last time. It won't be." Reading through those pages felt like eavesdropping on disappointment. It broke my heart, because here was this brilliant, accomplished man, bailing out the same people who were sinking him. I once asked him, "Papa, why do you keep giving them more when they've never earned it?" His answer? "Because one day they'll need more than money, and I won't be here." At the time, I thought he meant love or maturity. Now I realize he meant me, because while they were busy draining his accounts, he was pouring himself into me, quietly, strategically, preparing me for what he knew was coming and what came next. It wasn't grief, it wasn't mourning, it was war. Because the moment his heart stopped, the vultures circled, and suddenly the same family that treated me like background noise for years wanted everything. The day we read the will, the air was too still. It was one of those cloudless Texas afternoons, bright, breezy, deceptively peaceful. I remember standing outside Mr. Jefferson's law office in downtown Austin, palms sweating despite the cool wind. My gut told me this wouldn't be a normal reading, not with my family. Inside, the room smelled like polished wood and old paper. Legal books lined the shelves. A portrait of a long-retired judge loomed above the fireplace, watching us like some silent referee. I took a seat across the long mahogany table, alone on one side. My mother arrived 15 minutes late, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and entitlement. She wore oversized black sunglasses and heels too high for morning. Kyle swaggered in behind her, phone in hand, probably live tweeting his own entrance. Brandon shuffled in last, hoodie up, earphones in. They sat together like a unified block. I sat across from them, like the accused. Mr. Jefferson, a lean, sharp-eyed man who'd served as my grandfather's attorney for over 2 decades, cleared his throat and began. At first, everything was polite, predictable, charitable donations to a local church, a stipend for Mr. Pena, the groundskeeper, a scholarship fund in Grandpa's name at UT Austin. I nodded along. These were things I expected, things that made sense. Then he turned the page. And to my granddaughter, Hazel Moore, I leave the remainder of my estate, including but not limited to all business holdings, real property, investment accounts, and personal effects, with the exception of items specifically allocated elsewhere in this document. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it presses against your chest. I felt my heart skip, not from shock, but from validation. I glanced across the table. My mother slowly removed her sunglasses. "What did you just say?" Her voice was low, dangerous. Mr. Jefferson didn't flinch. Mr. Moore instructed that all remaining assets be transferred solely to Hazel. "That's impossible," she snapped. "He wouldn't do that. I'm his daughter." I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but she turned on me. "You knew about this," she hissed. "Didn't you? You manipulated him. You were always sniffing around his business, pretending to care." Kyle leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "So what, you think just because you showed up to help at the store, you deserve everything? What about us?" Brandon muttered something I couldn't hear. Mr. Jefferson raised his hand calmly. "For the record, Mr. Moore was of sound mind when he updated his will 6 months ago. He completed a medical competency evaluation, which I have in file, and had multiple witnesses present. That only made things worse. 6 months ago?" My mother laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "He was sick." "You don't think that's suspicious?" "Actually," Mr. Jefferson said evenly, "it was his idea. He reached out to us directly." The room exploded. My mother launched into a rant about betrayal and favoritism. Kyle called it elder abuse. Brandon said I was cold and calculating. Meanwhile, I just sat there, stone-faced, because if I spoke, I would have screamed. When the shouting died down, my mother leaned across the table, her voice suddenly calm. "Look, Hazel, this can all be fixed. You don't have to make this ugly. Just sign over the accounts to me and we'll split it fairly. No lawyers, no drama." I looked her in the eye, those same hazel eyes I inherited from her, and said quietly, "That's not what Grandpa wanted." Her smile vanished. "What do you know about what he wanted?" she snapped. "I was his daughter for 55 years. You were just a project. A distraction." That one cut deep. I wanted to scream that I had been his shadow, that while they were all busy bleeding him dry, I was beside him, learning, listening, growing. That he had trusted me because I had earned it. But I said none of that. I just repeated, "It's in the will." "His choice." She stood abruptly. "Then we'll see you in court." The 3 of them stormed out, heels clicking, door slamming. I stayed seated. Mr. Jefferson gave me a long, measured look. "You okay?" "No," I admitted. "But I will be." Because I knew this wasn't just about inheritance, it was about control, and for the first time in my life, I had it. What followed that day wasn't just tension, it was tactical warfare. Within hours, vague posts appeared on social media. Some people would betray their own blood for $1. "Be careful who you trust. Even family will steal from you. Phone calls flooded in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, each one dripping with faux concern. "I'm just surprised," one aunt said. "Your mom gave up so much for you. Don't you think she deserves something?" Kyle left me 3 voicemails that night, each more aggressive than the last. The final one ended with, "You have no idea what you've started." Brandon messaged me once, "Hope it was worth it." And my mother? She showed up at my office. I watched from behind the blinds as she argued with reception, demanding to speak with me. She called my boss's direct line, told her I was unwell, under pressure, unstable. It was harassment disguised as concern. Eventually, HR stepped in. My boss, bless her heart, offered me paid leave. "Sort things out," she said. "And don't worry, we've blocked her number." I thanked her, but deep down I knew this was just the beginning. Because when someone feels entitled to your success, your boundaries feel like betrayal. And when money's involved, family becomes battlefield. It didn't take long for the war to leave the lawyer's office and seep into my real life. At first, it was small things, passive-aggressive texts, a cold shoulder from people I'd known since childhood. A few family friends stopped replying to my messages. Others began commenting under old Facebook posts with those backhanded platitudes like, "family over everything." Shame some people forget that. But then it escalated. My phone became a battleground. My mother, my brothers, aunts I hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly they all had something to say. And they weren't shy about saying it. "You're breaking this family apart. Grandpa would be ashamed. Do the right thing before it's too late." I stopped answering calls. Then I stopped reading texts. Eventually, I stopped opening my social media entirely, but it found me anyway. One morning at work, my manager Barbara pulled me into her office. She looked concerned, more confused than angry. "Hazel, is everything okay at home?" I froze. Apparently, my mother had called the office 3 times, saying she was worried about my mental state and asking if HR could intervene. She left messages hinting at breakdowns, instability, even substance abuse. I felt humiliated, but more than that, I felt betrayed, not just by her, but by how quickly the world believes the loudest voice in the room, especially when it's framed as care. Barbara was kind, thankfully. She offered me some paid time off, told me to take a breath. I agreed, mostly because I needed space. Not just from the job, but from the noise. When I got home that day, I found a letter shoved under my apartment door. No return address. Just 6 words typed in bold. "That money won't save you." I stood frozen in my hallway, heart pounding, not because I was afraid of physical danger yet, but because this meant someone had been here, close enough to know where I lived, close enough to touch my door. That night I changed the locks, and I started sleeping with my phone recording, just in case. Meanwhile, the online attacks ramped up. My cousin Becca posted an Instagram story with a screenshot of a text my mom had sent her, cropped just right to make me look like I'd stolen the inheritance out from under everyone. The caption read, "Imagine prioritizing money over your own blood." Kyle tweeted vague threats about lawsuits and reclaiming what was never hers to begin with. Brandon posted a TikTok that was clearly about me, something about fake sisters who smile while they stab you. None of it mentioned my name. But everyone knew. I became the villain of a family saga I never agreed to star in. And then there were the direct messages. Some were pitying. "I know this must be hard on your mom." Some were venomous. "You'll be alone forever. Greed eats its own." But the worst ones were from people who used to know me, old classmates, neighbors, even a former church friend who sent me a Bible verse about dishonoring your mother and the wrath of God. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should have just split the estate. Maybe peace was more important than principle. I brought all of this, every message, every voicemail, every toxic post, to Ethan, my boyfriend. He listened without interruption, his jaw tight, fists clenched. Then he looked at me and said, "Hazel, this isn't family conflict, this is psychological warfare." He was right, because it wasn't just pressure, it was coordinated manipulation. A slow, systematic attempt to wear me down until I caved. And the worst part? It almost worked. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself, is this worth it? What was I protecting? A hardware business? Some real estate? A dwindling bank account? But every time I got close to that edge, I remembered his voice. Papa's voice. They're going to come for it, and you'll be the only one who doesn't ask, but the only one who knows how to keep it alive. He wasn't just talking about assets, he was talking about values. That's when I stopped reacting and started documenting. I saved every message, recorded every phone call, legal in Texas with one-party consent. I even installed a Ring camera at my door and security cameras inside my apartment. Then, with Ethan's help, I contacted Samantha Reyes, a family law attorney and estate conflict specialist. I laid out the whole story. No filter. No sugarcoating. She listened carefully, then leaned back and said, "They're trying to force a voluntary transfer so they don't have to contest the will, but if you give in, it won't end here. People like this don't stop once they get a taste of power, they escalate." She was right again, because the next thing that happened was an invitation. A simple text from my mother. "Family dinner this Sunday? Let's talk this out. No threats, no guilt, just calm." Controlled, almost normal, but I knew better. This wasn't dinner. This was a trap. There's a moment in every war when the defender stops retreating and starts reclaiming ground. For me, that moment came the night I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by printed screenshots, recorded voicemails, and 1,000 digital cuts from the people who were supposed to love me. That's when I realized I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the firewall. And I had to act like it. I called Ethan first. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Finally." Then we called Samantha Reyes. Samantha wasn't just a lawyer, she was a strategist, the kind of woman who wore simple black suits and spoke in calm, terrifying precision. She'd handled messy estate disputes before, but even she paused when I told her just how personal this was. "Your grandfather left you everything," she repeated, her brows raised. "And since then, they've launched a coordinated emotional siege." "That's a polite way of putting it," I muttered. She gave me a tight smile. "Good news is, bullies tend to get sloppy when challenged. But we'll need to do this smart." We set up boundaries, fast. First, all communication from my family was to go through her office. That meant calls, emails, even friendly check-ins. If it didn't come through Samantha, it didn't reach me. Second, we began assembling my defense portfolio, the will. Grandpa's medical records from the last year of his life, our text messages dated and archived, photos of us at family events, business meetings, even hospital visits where he was clearly lucid, and, most importantly, witnesses Samantha's voice sharpened. If they want to claim undue influence, we'll bury them in evidence of intent. Ethan became my emotional bodyguard. He cooked for me, made sure I slept, watched dumb shows with me when I couldn't silence the anxiety. But he also reminded me, daily, of what this was really about. "You're not protecting money," he said. "You're protecting meaning. Your grandfather gave you this not because he pitied you, but because he trusted you." That hit deep. Because somewhere in the whirlwind of pressure, I had started to question that. Had started to feel like maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe it was unfair. Maybe I had taken too much. But then I'd read Grandpa's words again, his voice in every sentence, and I'd remember why I couldn't fold. This wasn't just legal. It was personal. I started keeping a log of everything, date and time of calls, content of messages, who posted what on social media, screenshots of relatives trying to guilt-trip me through mutual friends. Samantha reviewed them all, tagging each incident as either harassment, character attack, or intent to manipulate. She was building a case, not just in court, but in narrative. "They're trying to isolate you," she said. "Our job is to show they've done this before, to him." That's when I remembered something Grandpa once told me. It was during a late night at his study. He was sipping decaf and scribbling in a small notebook. "When people show you who they are with money," he said, "believe them the first time." I hadn't understood that then. I did now. We found old financial records, copies of transfers from Grandpa's personal accounts to my mom, Kyle, Brandon, loans that were never repaid, medical expenses that mysteriously aligned with vacations or luxury purchases. Samantha flagged over 20 transactions as possible financial coercion. "If this goes to court," she explained, "we present this not as revenge, but as a pattern, a documented trail of manipulation." That word, manipulation, started to shift in my mind, because up until then I'd been calling it family pressure. But it wasn't. It was systemic, coordinated, strategic. And I was done letting it work. Ethan helped me rehearse responses. He printed statements, built folders, created backups. He looked me in the eye one night and said, "You've been surviving their tactics your whole life. This time you're responding." He was right. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I felt prepared. And I wasn't walking into that dinner as the quiet daughter anymore. I was walking in as Franklin Moore's chosen heir, and I was bringing backup. Just when I thought I had all the tools I needed, lawyers, documents, strategy, fate handed me something far more powerful. My grandfather's voice. Not a memory, not a vague feeling, but his actual voice, inked in his handwriting, tucked inside an envelope sealed with purpose. It started with a call. Captain Richard Miles, my grandfather's closest friend, his golf buddy, his war comrade, called me out of the blue. "You got time to meet?" he asked. "There's something Franklin left for you. Said I'd know when the time was right." I met him at a diner just outside town. The kind of place with cracked leather booths and bottomless black coffee. He slid a small envelope across the table. Yellowed edges. My name, Hazel, written in firm, confident script. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, dated about 3 months before Grandpa passed. Not a goodbye, not sentimental. It read like a mission briefing. "Hazel, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has happened. I didn't leave everything to you because I wanted to cause drama. I did it because you were the only one who saw the value behind the numbers. The only one who never asked, but always earned. I've watched the rest of this family misuse every opportunity I gave them. I enabled some of it, I know. I kept hoping they'd change. They didn't, but you showed up. You learned. You stayed when it was inconvenient. You listened when no one else did. They will say this is favoritism, that I was manipulated. You and I both know better. Stand firm. Do not let guilt cloud your judgment. They will weaponize your heart if you let them. This legacy is not about wealth, it's about values. Protect it, build on it. And don't look back. Franklin." I must have read it a dozen times. Each sentence hit like thunder, solid, grounding, clarifying. He knew this fight would come. He planned for it. But Captain Miles wasn't done. "There's more," he said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a leather-bound book, thick, heavy, worn from years of use. "His personal ledger," Miles explained. He called it the real history of this family. Back home, I laid it open on my kitchen table like it was sacred. Inside, 10 years of handwritten entries, date, amount, recipient, reason, result. But it wasn't just a log of transactions, it was a diary of disappointment. Notes scribbled in the margins. Teresa, $15,000 for Jason's surgery. Turns out it was a spa retreat. Kyle again. Another startup, no plan, no results. Brandon claimed anxiety meds, spent it on a gaming rig. I confronted him. He cried, I relented. Each line a quiet heartbreak. Each note a small surrender. Toward the final pages, the tone shifted, grew colder, more resigned. They are draining me faster than I can rebuild. Hazel is my only hope. Final decision made, will updated. I pray she has more courage than I did. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before he died. Hazel will face the wolves alone, but she knows how to hold the line. I closed the book slowly. It felt like he was still here, across the table, handing me the baton. That night I scanned every page, sent it to Samantha. Stored backups on 3 separate drives, printed hard copies and put them in a fireproof box. This wasn't just protection. This was evidence, but more than that, this was validation. I wasn't imagining the manipulation. I wasn't overreacting. And I wasn't wrong to fight back. Because Franklin Moore, patriarch, veteran, builder of legacies, had seen it all. And he chose me anyway. Sunday night came like a storm I'd seen on the radar for weeks. Inevitable, creeping, quietly violent. The family dinner was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. Sharp. I arrived at 5:58, portfolio in hand, heart beating like war drums in my chest. My blazer was navy. My blouse was white, classic, clean, intentional. I wore my grandfather's cuff bracelet, polished brass, inscribed inside with just 2 words, hold steady. As I stepped onto the porch of my childhood home, something shifted in the air. The lights inside were dim, curtains drawn, as if intimacy could disguise intention. I rang the bell, though I still had my old key. A show of respect, or maybe a warning. My mother opened the door with a practiced smile. "Hazel," she said, her tone syrupy, strained. "Right on time." I stepped inside and immediately felt the tension. Kyle and Brandon were seated at the dining room table, both dressed nicer than usual. Kyle wore a blazer that still had a price tag string hanging from the sleeve. Brandon looked like he'd been forced into a button-down, his face stiff and unreadable. But the real giveaway was the 2 men seated at the far end of the table. One wore a burgundy tie, the other navy. Both carried leather briefcases and expressions that said, "We've done this before." "Hazel," my mother gestured, "this is Mr. Douglas and Mr. Shaw. They're here to help mediate a family solution." There it is, I thought, the script. The setup, the bait. I nodded, tight-lipped, and took a seat. Not at the head, not at the side, but squarely across from the mediators. I placed my leather portfolio calmly on the table in front of me. Dinner, it seemed, would not be served. Mr. Douglas cleared his throat. "We understand this has been a difficult time for your family. Our goal here is to reach an agreement that's equitable and preserves unity." I tilted my head. Interesting. I thought Grandpa already did that, through his will. Mr. Shaw leaned forward. "Legal instruments don't always reflect emotional realities." I smiled. "Luckily, they do reflect actual law." My mother's voice was light but cold. "Hazel, this doesn't have to be adversarial." "We're all just trying to move forward," Kyle chimed in. "We're family, we shouldn't be fighting over money." I looked at him flatly. "Then why did you bring 2 lawyers?" "Advisors," my mother corrected quickly. "Not lawyers, they're here to facilitate." "Facilitate what exactly?" I asked, though I already knew. Mr. Douglas opened his briefcase and produced a thick folder. This is a proposed voluntary redistribution agreement. You would transfer administrative control of more lumber supply to your mother, assign the investment accounts to a family trust, and retain a generous personal allocation of 20%. I stared at the document. No shame, no irony. Just cold numbers and betrayal printed in Times New Roman. "And the real estate?" I asked, voice steady. "Liquidated," Mr. Shaw replied. "Proceeds divided evenly among the siblings." "For equity," my mother added. "You've always been about fairness." I almost laughed. Instead, I opened my own portfolio and laid out 3 items: a certified copy of the will, a notarized letter from Grandpa detailing his intent, scanned pages of his ledger, each with dates, names, and dollar amounts of the help they had received. The room went still. "Before you ask me to sign anything," I said, "we're going to talk about this." My mother's eyes narrowed. "You went through his things?" "He left them to me," I reminded her. "Along with everything else." Brandon muttered, "That's not what he would have wanted." "No?" I asked, flipping to a specific page. "Because right here he writes, Brandon asked for $9,000 for dental surgery, found Instagram photos of him in Cancun." Brandon flushed red. Kyle stood. "You're twisting everything." I turned another page. Kyle's pitch for VR football training? No business plan, just buzzwords. $30,000 lost. My mother's voice turned icy. "This is out of context." "Fine," I said, pulling out the letter. "Let's read context out loud." I read Grandpa's words slowly, deliberately, letting each line land like a gavel in a courtroom. "They will say this is favoritism. That I was manipulated. You and I both know better. Stand firm. Do not let guilt cloud your judgment. They will weaponize your heart if you let them." My voice didn't shake. Theirs did. Mr. Douglas began packing up. "Perhaps we should reconvene." "No need," I said. "There will be no redistribution. There will be no transfer. The estate stands as written. And if anyone attempts to challenge it in court, know that I have more documentation, including recorded phone calls, text messages, and bank records." I stood, gathered my portfolio. "You tried to ambush me with shame and paperwork. But you forgot the one thing Grandpa taught me better than anyone." They all stared. I smiled, not with kindness but with conviction. Preparation. And with that, I walked out the front door, head high, heart steady, leaving their silence behind me like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. I thought that was the end of it. After I walked out of that dining room turned interrogation chamber, I expected the silence to last. I expected the backlash to simmer and morph into rumors. I expected my family to do what they always did, circle the wagons and spin their own version of the truth. What I didn't expect was the knock on my door the next morning. 3 soft raps. Hesitant, not angry, not demanding. I looked through the peephole. It was Kyle. He stood there alone, no briefcase, no backup. Just him, hands stuffed in the pockets of a windbreaker he hadn't worn since college, face pale like he hadn't slept. I opened the door, slowly. He looked up, met my eyes, then dropped his gaze again. "Can I come in?" he asked. I paused, then stepped aside. He didn't sit right away, just hovered near the kitchen counter like he wasn't sure if this was a meeting or a surrender. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch, waiting to see where this was going. Finally, he exhaled. "I didn't know about the ledger or the letter." "She never told us he left anything personal like that." "She?" I asked. He nodded. "Mom?" "She said it was all business, legal. Said you'd twisted Grandpa during his final months." "And you believed her?" I said flatly. He didn't flinch. "Yeah, I did, because that's what we were raised to do, believe her, defend her, no matter how crazy it sounded." He finally looked up. "Hazel, I'm not here to beg for a share or to change your mind. I'm here because I realized something last night. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. You're the only one who's been consistent, he said. You showed up for Grandpa. You didn't take money. You didn't lie. You didn't manipulate. And I treated you like the enemy because you held up a mirror to everything we didn't want to see. His voice cracked slightly. I just came to say, I'm sorry. That word hit harder than any lawsuit threat, because in our family, sorry was rare, and from Kyle, practically mythical. I didn't respond right away. My chest was tight, and not from anger, from disbelief. For so long, Kyle had been the golden boy, the charmer, the one who could do no wrong, until the results didn't show up and the excuses dried out. And now here he was, humbled, human. What changed? I asked. He hesitated. Mom did after you left. She lost it. Started screaming about how Grandpa never respected her, how the business should have been hers since day one. Brandon tried to calm her down, and she turned on him. Called him useless, said he cost her the trust fund. He looked down. It wasn't about unity. It was about control. I knew that already, but hearing Kyle say it, that made it real. He rubbed his face. It broke something in me. Watching her go from manipulative to vicious, turning on everyone in the room the second things didn't go her way. He looked at me again. She doesn't love us, Hazel. She uses us, and I let her. The silence between us changed, no longer cold. Now tentative, fragile. I'm not asking to be your business partner, he said quickly. I want to help, however you'll let me. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I nodded slowly. Okay, I said, but we do this on my terms. He nodded, eyes earnest. Whatever you say. You start by shadowing the operations team at the North Lamar store. You clock in, you learn inventory, logistics, staffing schedules, no special treatment. He smiled, genuinely. Got it. And one more thing, I added, walking toward my desk. I pulled out a manila folder, inside a printout from Grandpa's ledger, Kyle's largest loan entry complete with his own annotations. I handed it to him. You repay this, I said. Not to me, to the business. Installments? Interest-free. But you pay it back, fully, because that's how we rebuild trust here. Kyle looked at the paper for a long time, then nodded. I will, he said. All of it. He stood, took a breath. I don't expect Mom to forgive this, he said quietly. She'll see it as betrayal. Then maybe, I said, it's time she learns what loyalty really looks like. He smiled faintly, eyes misting over. Then he left, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own bloodline. I felt like someone who had broken the cycle. After Kyle left that morning, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring out the window. It was still. Quiet. The kind of silence that used to feel empty. Now it felt full. Like something had shifted. Like I had finally reclaimed not just what was mine, but what I was meant to carry forward. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to flaunt my win. I wanted something my family had forgotten a long time ago. Stability, purpose, legacy. And so I started rebuilding, but not from anger, from alignment. The first thing I did was walk back into Moore Lumber Supply, not as Franklin's granddaughter, but as its new CEO. The staff, some of whom had worked under my grandfather for 30-plus years, watched me with polite skepticism at first. I didn't blame them. They'd seen enough entitled Moores walk through those doors without lifting a finger. They probably thought I'd be more of the same. I wasn't. For the next 6 weeks, I showed up before opening and stayed after closing. I sat in on vendor meetings. I rode along on delivery trucks. I reworked inventory systems, I answered phones and unloaded pallets. I earned my spot, just like Grandpa taught me. Kyle followed through on his word. He showed up to his first day at the North Lamar branch without ego. He learned SKU systems, stocked shelves, listened to employees with more experience than him, and most importantly, he stayed quiet unless he had something real to say. That was new. That was progress. I set up weekly accountability check-ins for both of us, not just for business operations, but for emotional temperature too. I didn't want another cycle of silence and resentment. Transparency, I learned, was the antidote to family dysfunction. Meanwhile, the more I dug into the business, the more I realized how outdated some of Grandpa's systems had become, not because he was lazy, but because he was loyal. He held on to vendors who overcharged, refused to digitize certain processes because paper never crashes, kept aging buildings that bled maintenance costs. Respecting the past didn't mean preserving the flaws. So I modernized, but carefully. We launched an eco-friendly line of building supplies, partnered with local sustainable lumber sources, introduced biodegradable packaging, created a pilot program with a vocational school nearby to train young people in green construction principles. Grandpa would have called it hippie nonsense with a smirk, but I know deep down he would have loved the results. Revenue went up, waste went down, customer engagement skyrocketed. But beyond numbers, something more important happened. Trust returned. Employees who had kept their heads down for years started speaking up again. Customers told stories about Mr. Moore and how he helped them fix their first homes, and now they said, "It feels like he's still here." That meant everything. But it wasn't just about the business. I also turned my attention to the Moore Foundation, a charitable trust I created in his name. Its mission was simple: empower young people with tools to build something real, whether that was a trade, a business, or just a plan to get out of debt. We offered microloans for teen entrepreneurs, workshops on financial literacy for single moms, internships at our stores for kids aging out of foster care. The first workshop had only 9 attendees. 6 months later, we had over 200 applications and a wait list. Ethan helped build the marketing arm. Samantha assisted with legal frameworks. Kyle even pitched a podcast about modern trades and legacy building for millennials. And me, I found joy again, real joy, not the kind you post online, the kind that lives in your chest, that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. My relationship with Kyle remained cautious, but strong. Brandon stayed distant, and my mother, she didn't reach out. Not once, but I didn't chase her either. I had offered her truth. She chose pride. That wasn't mine to fix. Instead, I focused forward. I renovated Grandpa's old office, left one wall untouched, the one with all his plaques, his framed store-opening photo, his old Navy cap. I placed his journal in a glass case beside it. A reminder that we don't protect legacies by locking them away. We protect them by living them forward. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for letting me tell a story that, for a while, I wasn't sure I'd ever be brave enough to say out loud. I used to think legacy was about inheritance, about what's written in a will, a title, a bank account. But now, standing on the other side of firestorms and signatures, I know better. Legacy is about decisions. It's about how you respond when the people you love become the ones trying hardest to break you. It's about choosing integrity over approval. It's about building something that lasts longer than you and costs more than just money to protect. My grandfather didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a standard, and in trying to live up to it, I found out who I actually am, outside the noise, the pressure, the manipulation. I learned that silence can be its own weapon, and that boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges, built only for those willing to cross with respect. If you're facing something like I did, a family conflict over money, trust, or history, Know this. You are not selfish for saying no. You are not disloyal for protecting what you earned. You are not the villain in a story just because others refuse to grow. You're allowed to honor love and enforce limits. You're allowed to rewrite the ending, and maybe, just maybe, your courage to stand firm will become someone else's starting point. Have you ever been pressured to give up something that was rightfully yours for the sake of family? Have you had to draw boundaries that others called betrayal? Drop your story in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's own it. And if this story hit home for you, if it reminded you of your own strength, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who might need it today, because the real legacy is who we become when we refuse to be broken. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing your ground when it came to family and finances? What did it cost you, and was it worth it? Share your experience in the comments. Let's start a real conversation. And if Hazel's story hit close to home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for what comes next.